How to TIG weld a carbon steel T-joint. We're going to do a little bit of 11 gauge hot rolled steel as well as some cold rolled, and then shift gears and do some 1/4 inch and talk about things like rules of thumb for amperage, gas flow, and whatever comes up along the way. The first T-joint is this hot rolled. You can see I've got the mill scale cleaned off, but let's talk about electrode extension and gas flow rate. A pretty good rule of thumb for stick out or electrode extension is no more than the inside diameter of the cup. Of course, there are times when you need a longer stick out than that to reach a tight spot, but that's a good rule of thumb. A pretty good rule of thumb for gas flow rate is 2 to 3 CFH per cup size. There's also a rule of thumb for amperage when it comes to carbon steel, and that is 1 amp per 1/1000th of thickness. But it's a pretty good rule of thumb. It only holds true up to about 125 thousandths, then it takes a nosedive off the cliff. So this first joint is hot rolled steel, 11 gauge, but by the time I removed all the mill scale, it mic'd out around 109 thousandths. So we're going to test that out and use exactly 109 amps, 1 amp per 1/1000ths, and see how that works. This is the old version of the PrimeWeld 225. That one is sold out and no longer available, but the new version is in stock now. Okay, back to those rules of thumb. Tungsten extension, no more than the inside diameter of the cup. And then argon flow, 2 to 3 CFH per cup size. Number 7 cup, 7 times 3 CFH is 21 CFH. I've got a little bit long of an electrode extension for filming the arc, and that's why I'm using the full 3 per cup size. Let's get into it. 109 amps, 1 amp per 1/1000th of thickness. Let's see if that works. I'm full pedal here with that machine, reading out 109 amps, and it's just about right. I could go a little hotter. I wouldn't want to go a whole lot colder. You can make a lot of adjustments with your travel speed, but when you're learning, you kind of just want to take it easy and go nice and slow like this. And so 109 amps is letting me go fairly slow. What I'm trying to do is dab that filler once per second, or roughly once per second. I'm trying to scoot the torch ahead the same distance each time, and I'm trying to add the same amount of filler each time while I try to keep the hot tip of that rod shielded with argon gas. The fact that I've cleaned all the mill scale and I'm really welding on clean, bright metal makes a huge difference. Just a minute ago, I talked about a rule of thumb for electrode extension as well as gas flow rate. So for this next joint on 11 gauge cold rolled, I'm going to pick a ceramic Jazzy tin cup. I came up with this little product, and it's available on my store right now. It's a gauge for electrode extension, and it's also got a chart for flow rates per cup size. I tried to make it as affordable as possible. I know that experienced welders don't really need one of these, but I think it'll help some people. All right, so here's another joint. This is cold rolled, 11 gauge also, since I didn't have to do any grinding on this one to speak of. It's 120 thousandths is what it measured. I'm using 120 amps, and that's going pretty good at 120 amps. You could probably go as high as 160 or so if your travel speed's fast enough on this, but 120 is getting the job done. Once again, I'm using the exact same technique that I was earlier on the previous joint. I'm trying to dab rod about once a second or so. I'm trying to keep the hot tip of that rod within the argon envelope so it doesn't get oxidized. If you take it in and out really far, you can notice when you put it back in the puddle, it adds a lot of oxidation to the puddle. That slows the puddle down, makes it a little bit more sluggish. You don't want a sluggish puddle. When you got a sluggish puddle, it requires more amperage to move it along. The Furic Jazzy tin cup puts out a lot of argon shielding, a big argon envelope. So it really helps with that, keeping the hot tip of the rod shielded. Here it is at half speed. Sometimes it's helpful to slow things down to try to talk about things. I'm really trying to keep an eye on the front or leading edge of that puddle. Keep a tight arc. I want that puddle to go all the way to the root of the joint. I don't want any C-shaped or boomerang-shaped puddle going on. I want to make sure I got penetration into the root of the joint, trying to keep my weld small. Of these 3 joints, the T-joint takes a little bit more amperage. You can see that the corner joint only took 92 amps, the lap joint 117, and the T-joint took 120. I didn't actually set the machine exactly that, but I had a camera on the readout while I was welding each of them. It's important to be able to make a good restart. You can stop as many times as you need to if you can make a good restart, and it's also important to have a leak-proof joint. I light up, grow the puddle to where it kind of matches the previous crater, and then back up a little bit and start adding rod, and that usually blends in pretty nicely. I'll show that in slow motion again in just a second. It's hard to talk about something with it at full speed, so we'll slow it down here at half speed. Okay, I'm going to light up right in the center of the crater, and then point toward the center of the crater, increase my amperage with the foot pedal until the puddle size matches the size of the crater, and then you might see me back up just one ripple, just to make sure it all blends in nicely. And all the while I'm keeping an eye on the front edge of that puddle to make sure it's going right down into the V, into the root of the joint. This is where arc length is super important. Torch angle matters a lot too, but not nearly as much as arc length. And in fact, if you've got your arc length good and tight, torch angle can be really very forgiving. Once again, I'm using 120 amps. I am using 1/16 ER70S6 filler metal for this. You could also use S2. Both of them work pretty good for this application. Good clean metal. That Jazzy 10 ceramic is giving me really good shielding, and I'm holding a tight arc. All right, let's take a look at a practical example of a bracket utilizing a T-joint welded both sides, 1/4 inch thickness. A T-joint is a super common joint, and it's used for brackets, gussets, bracing, all kinds of things like that. This is 1/4 inch thickness here. I'm using 160 amps, 1/16 filler metal. For this weld, I'm using a number 8 clear cup. The biggest reason I use clear cups is for filming, but I learned really quickly they help me to see a lot better too. Sometimes I have trouble seeing where I'm going, seeing all around the puddle and everything, and a number 8 clear or a number 7 clear really lights things up, helps you kind of see where you're going better. So if you're having trouble seeing, a clear cup can help. If you don't need it, you don't need it. It's very common for a T-joint to be welded on both sides because it's much stronger that way. This is 1/4 inch thickness, or 250 thousandths, a good example of where that 1 amp per 1,000ths of a rule no longer applies. So I'm using 160 amps here. It's plenty hot enough. I don't need 250 amps. And if it was a 1/2 inch thick, that'd be 500 thousandths. It certainly wouldn't need 500 amps. But for 125 thousandths and under, it's a pretty darn good rule of thumb. Let's take a look at another one. I've got a big block of aluminum resting on there, really just for a weight to keep this thing from chattering. Another good rule of thumb is for arc length. Your arc length should be about your electrode diameter or slightly less. So if you're using a 332 electrode, a 332 arc length is going to get you right in the ballpark. If you're doing really thin metal, you'll probably drop down to a 1/16 or smaller electrode, and your arc length will tighten up a little bit. Good rule of thumb. Another practical application would be welding a flange plate on the end of a piece of square tubing. In this case, again, I'm going to be using 160 amps. Wall thickness is 1/4 inch of the plate as well as the tubing wall thickness. All the same best practices apply. Keep a nice tight arc length, limit your torch angle, try to move along at even increments, keep the hot tip of that rod shielded. A really common mistake that I have seen beginners and students make is too long of an arc length. Here's another shot of a nice tight arc length. Things are going well, but now all of a sudden, all I did different was hold a long arc. And you can see the rod is now blobbing and falling in there instead of metering in there precisely. Things aren't going very well. But all I need to do is tighten that arc length up and not do anything else different, and all of a sudden, like night and day. So once again, rule of thumb, arc length should be electrode diameter or less. If you're a welding student and you think you might get into pipe welding, you'll do yourself a favor to get a little practice on multiple pass T-joints on something like a 1/4 inch thickness, because that's kind of like a socket weld. I'm going to use a torch switch here and just set the amperage on the machine, but you also should get some practice using a scratch start rig. You ever heard of the ABCs of welding? Always be comfortable. I'm using a TIG finger right here, not so much for heat protection because I'm resting on the aluminum block, but just to glide along and be nice and comfortable so I won't be worn out at the end of the day. I'm using the lay wire technique here because often this is done on socket welds. This is the first pass of a multiple pass T-joint. I'm just gliding along, nice and easy, taking my time, but all the same things apply. I'm keeping a nice tight arc. I don't have to worry so much about shielding the tip of that wire because I'm not coming in and out of the puddle. But a tight arc is really important, and having enough amperage is important to get penetration there. Now I know it doesn't quite look like it, but I did do a cut and etch test on this thing, and it did get right in there like it's supposed to get. We'll come over this thing with a second pass in just a minute, because that is kind of the way socket welds work. You have to do more than one pass on socket welds, or at least you're supposed to. That is what most of the welding codes specify anyway. So that's one pass. Makes for a nice even pattern, doesn't it? And so now we'll come right over top of that with a second pass, just zigzagging or weaving just a little bit, just like you would on the second pass of a socket weld. If you want to really make it like a socket weld, you could do a lap joint where you'd have to really watch the corners. If you are in welding school and you're going to do a multiple pass T-joint like this, you want to get as much practice and much seat time as you can out of these two pieces of metal. There's no point in stopping after only two passes. You can stack as many passes as you can fit on these two pieces of metal, and that type of practice pays big dividends. And once again, get your instructor to show you how to hook up a dry rig, a torch with a valve hooked up to a stick welder or a TIG welder, but know how to hook up a dry rig before you go to work. Hey, let me invite you to take advantage of our other free welding guides. They're full of short, concise videos just like the one you just watched. The way to access them is go to weldmonger.com, go to the search bar, type in workbook. That's going to take you to a page like this. Just select the workbook you want or all of them. That'll take you to a download page. I'll also put the link in the description here. Just add them to cart just like you would a product. You'll see that they're $0. Won't cost you a thing. Then you'll download the PDF and that'll look something like this. You click on the first video to get started and you're off to the races. Really short introduction video, and we'll start off by hooking up the argon for a new machine, talking about polarity, why we weld steel on DC and aluminum on AC, what does high frequency do, how to sharpen electrodes, what happens if you sharpen them wrong and split one, the different purposes for different angles of electrodes, getting started running beads without filler on steel, and then progressing right to aluminum right away. Some little tricks on how to establish consistency, how to get that filler rod hand up to speed, different techniques for feeding rod. And of course you're going to see crystal clear arc shots like this one, along with simple explanations on how to get the best results. There's a certain sequence of training and learning how to TIG weld that I learned over years of training welders at Delta Airlines. You'll get it all here for free.